This year marks the 75th anniversary of the Auschwitz Liberation Commemoration. 6 million Jews and millions of other people suffered as a result of mindsets that pit one group of people against others.
You know, Holland, the annual audit from the Anti Defamation League identified 2,107 anti-Semitic incidents in 2019. That was up 12% from the 1,879 that were recorded in 2018. These offenses occurred in every state in the U.S. except Alaska and Hawaii. Tonight, we have invited two guests to the Afterword table to help us gain some understanding behind the stereotypes and stories surrounding anti-Semitism.
Hi, I'm Holland Webb.
Hi, I'm Amy Boland.
And you're listening to The Afterword, a conversation about the future of words.
Our first is Dr. Melinda Menzer from Furman University. She's a professor and an activist. Welcome, Melinda. Please tell us a little bit about what you're working on currently.
Thank you so much, Amy and Holland, for having me. Currently, in my academic life, I'm working on a project about the intersection between white supremacy and attitudes about language superiority. So starting from Nazi attitudes about Yiddish being a degenerate language and moving up to the present day where we so unfortunately see attacks, both verbal and sometimes physical, against people speaking languages other than English in public. So that is something that I'm doing in my work as an English linguist. In my life as an activist, I am sort of in between projects due to the pandemic. I primarily focus on raising funds and awareness for HIAS. HIAS is the world's oldest refugee agency. It was founded in 1881 to help Eastern European Jews who were escaping oppression and coming to the United States. Today, they work to help refugees and asylum seekers of all faiths, and they help them all over the world. And because I believe that it's a good idea to use what you can do well to do good, one of the things I do well is that I swim. And I have done two fundraisers for HIAS under the name Swim for HIAS. The most recent one was in the fall of last year. Just to connect it a little bit to our topic today, I did it on the 1-year anniversary of the murders at Tree of Life Synagogue. Part of the reason that the murderer targeted Tree of Life was because of their work with HIAS and part of his conspiracy theories tying Jews together as part of a plan to overthrow white America by helping refugees. So I am currently looking for my third swim. And I know we're not going to talk about swimming today, but if any of your listeners have suggestions, I'm looking for a good long swim. So thank you for having me.
Wonderful. Well, we will connect HIAS to our show notes as well when we have the episode released in July. So we're going to really be excited for that, and maybe we'll find some takers on your swim plans.
Well, in order to share historical perspective and insight, we've invited Scott Auspelmyer, who was until just now a social studies teacher and has recently become the executive director for the South Carolina Holocaust Council. Scott, what have you been up to?
Well, thank you for inviting me to the program, first of all. And yes, I'm currently actually finishing up my school year. I have about a week left or so. And so I'm tying up all those loose ends and getting papers graded and entered and all that sort of thing, and planning graduation ceremonies and those sorts of things. With the ongoing pandemic in regards to the council, we've had to cancel several events that we typically would have each summer, including summer institutes for teachers and other things similar to that, workshops and so forth. So currently we are looking into, because obviously next year is a little bit unknown in terms of what's going to happen in the world of education, as far as what are we going to go back, full on into in-person schooling or virtually. And so what I will be focusing on over the next few months actually is developing virtual programming for teachers. And even if we don't end up having to go virtual, all virtual, we will still have that program available to them, which therefore broadens our approach anyways, moving forward. And so that's the key focus for us will be implementing virtual programming over the course of the next year, and then working to develop the institutes to happen again next summer as normal, God willing, with the issues with the pandemic. So that's a brief update as to what we're working on right now.
And you also have a new little life in your house. Tell us about that.
Yes, my wife just gave birth 2 weeks ago to my third son, Frederick James, and so that's also keeping us just a little bit busy as well. So there's a lot of change happening in our household in the next month or so, or has been happening for about a month now, and so we look forward to more exciting times in the future.
That is so wonderful to have the story of life continue. We're going to go ahead and jump right into our topic tonight, which is the Afterwords, asking this question: what are the stories that fuel human hatred and the rise of anti-Semitism? Melinda, I have heard you as an activist share some of your family's Holocaust story, but I would love for you to share a bit of it tonight for all of our listeners and those who are interested in this continuation of this story. So would you please share a bit?
Yes. I should say that I think about my family's Holocaust story in two parts. So one part has to do with the United States and the other has to do with Europe. But I think both of them have a lot to teach us about anti-Semitism. My grandfather came to the United States in 1925, so well before the Holocaust. He was from Lithuania, which may be a country your listeners know nothing about. At that time, it was a great center of Jewish thought and learning in Europe. Just a couple years before, the United States had put into position or had put into law quotas that established how many people could come into the United States from each European country. And those quotas were explicitly set up to exclude Jews and Roman Catholics. That wasn't a secret in any way. That was the purpose of the quotas. We permitted more people from largely Protestant countries to enter the United States and fewer people from largely Jewish or Roman Catholic countries. So very few people were permitted to immigrate from Lithuania. My grandfather, though, in a bit of irony, my grandfather held German citizenship. He had been born in what was then East Prussia. It is now the region called Kaliningrad, if you look at a map. He was the only one of his siblings born in East Prussia. The family then moved less than 10 miles over the border, and the rest of the children were born in Lithuania. So he was officially a German citizen, and because the United States preferred German citizens over Lithuanian citizens, he was allowed to come to the country when the rest of the family was not. There's much to say about the quota system, but just to connect it to knowledge you might already have, if you or maybe your children learned about the great age of immigration in school when people were coming in droves through Ellis Island and other ports, we had the Statue of Liberty erected, we had the idea of the melting pot. You know, the most important thing to note about that great wave of immigration was that it didn't end because people no longer wanted to come to the United States. It ended because the U.S. government passed laws stopping people from immigrating. And those restrictions were fueled by nativist impulses and largely fueled by anti-Semitism. We felt we had enough Jews. My grandfather, though, made it and survived, married, had 3 children. I think of us as an American success story. One of my favorite stories about my grandfather is that he was Lithuanian, but he learned to speak English in Boston, in the north end of Boston. And so he spoke English with an Italian accent. He had learned English from Italian immigrants. And so when my mother, his future daughter-in-law, first met him, she was very confused. Who was this Italian man? So anyway, meanwhile, The rest of the family remained in Lithuania. The city that he grew up in is called Jurberg. At the time that he left, it had 15,000 people in it, a mixed community of Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. It was, as I said, very close to the East Prussian border. So it was, therefore, one of the first places that was hit in the Nazi invasion and hit by Nazi death squads. We traveled to Lithuania in 2003 as a family. And the historian who showed us around the town, narrated for us. She is the one who did the research and wrote a thesis on what happened in that town. So she told us that the Nazis handed out whiskey and guns, and they told the Lithuanians, or I guess the Christian Lithuanians, that the Jews were evil and that they were in league with the communists and that they were responsible for all the hardships that they were experiencing. And in a matter of months then, the Nazi death squad, with the cooperation of those other Lithuanians, rounded up and killed the 2,000 Jews of Jurberg. So 2,000 people out of a population of 15,000. The story is terrible. There were public humiliations. There was public torture and rapes. There was a series of 4 massacres. And one of the saddest things about that is that while the Germans killed the Jews in the first massacre, the next 3 massacres, including the killing of the women, the children, and the babies, was done by their neighbors, other Lithuanians. Lithuanians who killed other Lithuanians with encouragement from the Nazi forces. So in a very short period of time, in a period of great struggle and upheaval, those occupying forces were able to tap into underlying anti-Semitism and get ordinary people, but also including people like the mayor of the town, the chief of police, other police officers, to participate in the murders of their neighbors.
Thank you, Melinda, for sharing. That's a hard story to hear. Ordinary people taking on a mindset, as you said, in a short amount of time.
That was such a powerful story. Scott, what can you tell us from your personal story or from your family's story?
Interesting enough, I know this in some ways may come as a shock to many people, but despite the fact that I lead now an organization dedicated to Holocaust education, I am not, in fact, Jewish. I've been teaching for 19 years. This is my 19th year of teaching. And for the past about 15 years, I've taught a specialty course on the Holocaust for high school students. And almost every year, I would have students, multiple students often, just assume that I was Jewish or expect me to be Jewish. And eventually some of them would ask me, are you Jewish? And I would say, no, I grew up in a Christian Protestant background, and that would always be fairly seemingly confusing to them to a degree. And I never suspected anything of it, nor do I think of anything of it today in terms of them having any malicious anti-Semitic feelings or anything of that nature. But it does beg the question, why should someone who is not Jewish be leading a Holocaust council, so to speak, to educate others? Is that okay, or is that appropriate? Or from my vantage point, I'm always consistently thinking, why isn't it appropriate for someone who is not Jewish to still lead an organization like this? And so just by virtue of that very question, I think inherently we have some issues clear. And I don't think this is a condition of necessarily American society or any given society, but it's a part of the human condition, that it would seem kind of awkward and seemingly unfamiliar for somebody who isn't from a particular background to be teaching about an event that significantly affected people from that background. So I see within that very benign question that students would often ask me, if I am Jewish, I see within that kind of how anti-Semitism and other forms of discrimination can kind of begin. And I would never assume that any of my students went on to become or hold anti-Semitic feelings. But you could see how from that very small step of, well, why would he be teaching about this? And why would he be so passionate about teaching about this if he himself is not Jewish? Because his people weren't directly affected, so to speak. And so it kind of speaks to a larger problem, I think, is where we have a challenge. Humanity has a challenge in caring for each other and how we respect each other. And so I think those differences that exist between us are often highlighted as opposed to the commonalities that should be highlighted, that should bring us together. We should celebrate our differences, but also really kind of celebrate the fact that we, in fact, are more similar than we are different.
Goodness. Humanity has a problem caring for each other. Those are very powerful words. You know, Scott, it's going to lead us into one of our questions, but we may have to digress a little bit because it really got me thinking through here about you, Holland, but my brain's kind of wanting to go down another rabbit hole, but we'll stick to this next question. In 2019, there was a big increase in anti-Semitic activity worldwide. There were attacks against Jews simply for being Jewish all over the world, including the largest massacre of Jews ever on American soil. And Melinda has already mentioned that, the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. The Atlantic published an article entitled 75 Years After Auschwitz, Anti-Semitism is on the Rise. And so we're going to dive into this. I'm sure it's very difficult to even begin to uncover all the root causes, but both of you have touched base a little bit on this. And I'll start with you first, Melinda. Why do you think anti-Semitism is growing again?
It is, as you said, a complicated question. And there are many factors that are contributing to it. I took a look at that Atlantic article, and it used the metaphor of a chronic disease to talk about anti-Semitism. And I think that for many years, people in this country, perhaps people in other countries, thought that anti-Semitism no longer existed. I have myself in the past had multiple conversations with people who were surprised to hear that I had experienced anti-Semitism or that my children had experienced anti-Semitism. I think about a time in the fall of 2016 where I was part of a discussion at Furman University. It wasn't about anti-Semitism, but a student stood up and said, "We are so divided as a nation, we don't agree on anything. The only thing we agree on, of course, is that the Holocaust was bad." And then he continued on. And I completely derailed the conversation in that discussion by stopping everyone and saying, you realize there are people who deny the existence of the Holocaust. There are people who celebrate the Holocaust. And in 2016, those lovely college students looked back at me as if I were crazy. Nobody thinks I'm crazy in 2020, unfortunately, with this huge rise. So they have always been out there. There are some factors at play that are helping white supremacists and anti-Semitic movements grow. I think the main ones, first of all, we have the internet, which is not a brand new phenomenon, but organizations like Stormfront have been around for over 20 years, bringing together anti-Semites, white supremacists from all over the globe to talk to each other. The network of people around the world is, I think, astonishing. And one only has to think here in South Carolina of Dylan Roof, who murdered 9 innocent people in Charleston, Black Americans, who posed for a picture in front of the Rhodesian flag, right? He was talking to white supremacists and anti-Semites all over the world, and they see themselves as a worldwide movement. And a movement of people who are communicating with each other and congratulating each other for the videos of the events, the graffiti and the vandalism that they share. And secondly, sadly, and this is not true just in the United States, it's true in other parts of Europe as well, but we are seeing, if not public approval by our leaders, we're seeing leaders who are unwilling to condemn acts of anti-Semitism. So, most famously, President Trump noted after the Charlottesville march that there were good people on both sides, right? After a march where people marched with tiki torches chanting, "Jews will not replace us." Perhaps less well known, as I alluded to before, when we think about the murders at Tree of Life Synagogue, the killer targeted that synagogue because of its work with refugees. He went online with his rants about dirty Jews helping dirty refugees destroy white America. And he condemned our President Trump, for not doing enough to stop refugees from coming into the United States. After his attack, the next time the United States set levels for refugee admissions, the Trump administration slashed them to all-time lows. They are at less than 10% of what they were during the Reagan administration. So if you are an anti-Semite or if you are a white supremacist, you can look at the behavior of our leaders and feel some confirmation there. I think that is a tragedy, a true tragedy for this country.
Scott, how about you? What would you be able to shed some light on?
I certainly would say that Melinda's spot on in terms of her analysis. And looking historically, that's more my background as a history teacher. And when I think about not simply history of Jews, but other peoples too, who have been heavily discriminated against. And when you study those time periods in which these discriminatory acts tend to flare up, they're typically in times of great fear and anxiety. If we have a current pandemic right now, and if you've been following what's been happening, there have been instances, of some of these protests that have happened in certain states. Michigan in particular, I think there are examples of anti-Semitic slogans being used and posters and things of that nature. But we typically see this willingness to accept extremist views and promote them during times of increased fear and anxiety. And certainly a pandemic is very much one of those times. But historically, if we look backwards, we can see that too during the Depression. Melinda mentioned this idea of quota systems and kind of restricting immigration and all that sort of thing. And that's all built around a nativist philosophy to a great degree, and there's lots of instances of that happening in the United States history, as well as the history of other countries too. We should understand this is not just an American problem. It's a worldwide phenomenon. The Americans were not the only ones who had significant quotas on people coming into their countries, nor are they still today. But when we look at examples too from history of specific laws, we think about the late 1800s, we had the Chinese Exclusionary Act. That was a law put in place to limit the immigration of a specific group of people, Chinese people coming into America, and it was based upon discriminatory beliefs. But what does that say when a law is created and sent to the public for them to understand? It is condoning essentially a discriminatory belief that there must be something wrong with these people if our country is not letting them in. And this law is specifically designed to do that, to not let them in. So in our past, we see inherently some of these problems, clearly. And we can look back to, certainly Jim Crow laws in the South and other things of that nature. And in present day, we see, similar challenges, as Melinda mentioned, with refugee policies and with, asylum seekers and other quotas. And a lot of that builds upon and feeds off of the fear and anxiety that the public has. Fear of immigrants potentially taking jobs. In people's minds, some people's minds, fear of immigrants polluting the culture of America, so to speak, and changing America to be something different than they want it to be. Social media, I think, really, with these extremist groups, and Melinda mentioned Stormfront as an example, these extremist groups kind of, prior to the 2000s were really kind of dwindling in some ways, in some areas. Social media provided, and the internet provided, a new outlet for them to really recruit, retain, and promote their ideas, and also recruit a lot of new followers. And so there's lots of different sites out there that they specialize in using. 4chan is one example, but there are other sites too. But and it's tough for any of these social media platforms to really effectively monitor and stop them from continuing to get around the system, so to speak, in order to try to stop that from happening. So when you have fear and anxiety, whatever the event may be that stems from, you're naturally, I think, going to have people want to lash out and blame somebody and want to find differences by which they argue those differences should lead us to create laws and policies that restrict others. And as a result, I think those sorts of feelings surface and become more plausible for many people's minds.
I really have enjoyed listening to this. I'm not sure enjoyed is the right word, but I have been just sitting here really captivated by the conversation in a way I not often am. But I know we've been talking so far mostly about the U.S., but the rise of anti-Semitism is not an American or uniquely U.S. phenomenon right now. It's I don't know if it's global, but it certainly is European as well as American. And I think back to last December when the UK had its elections. The Labour Party got handed a historic defeat. And of course, there were lots of reasons for that the Labour Party is trying to figure out right now. But one of those was anti-Semitism. I mean, it was overtly expressed by many members of the party, including its then leader, Jeremy Corbyn. And I think a lot of people were surprised because the Labour Party is a left-wing party. Left-wing parties typically want to stand up for minority groups. The Labour Party was standing up for, it seemed like, every conceivable minority group except Jews. So why is anti-Semitism one of those bigotries that can exist on both sides or on more than one side of the political spectrum and seemingly find a welcome there?
Yeah, I understand that. The particular question is very perplexing in many ways. I think we have to understand that some of the roots of anti-Semitism, and often sometimes historians refer to it as the longest hatred. It has deep roots which cut across the political spectrum in many ways because its roots are also founded in religion. And if we think about, the historically anti-Judaism before there was anti-Semitism, people dislike and hatred of the Jewish religion and people who followed it. And that was disliked by polytheistic groups and the Romans a long time ago, obviously, and following them were Christians. And adherents of religions tend to obviously cut across the political spectrum. So I think it's important to recognize that, whether you're politically right or left, it's very common for you to be at church with somebody who's of the opposing political viewpoint. And so that political diversity there within religions, I think, also kind of has fueled some of the anti-Semitic history, so to speak. Outwardly, the progressives, in particular on the far left, who express anti-Semitic inclinations tend to do so for two reasons. And there are many reasons, but these two really stand out to me. They position themselves as being the kind of defenders of the oppressed. And you mentioned minority groups, Holland. And so therefore, anybody who's perceived to be of privilege, often it could be, privilege could be a race thing, so whites, or a wealth thing, so those who are rich, or those who are in a position of power. So anybody who's perceived to be privileged, they therefore are the enemy of the progressives, even if some of the progressives themselves may be white, wealthy, and in power. So it's just kind of one of those oxymorons that they play with there. So for some progressives who adopt the age-old stereotype of Jews as wealthy and power hungry, and the assumption that Jews are mostly whites, you kind of have inherently an issue there for progressives to kind of latch onto as potentially for their dislike of Jews. Secondly, by connection to this idea of supporting victims and those who are oppressed, many people on the left, some of these far left progressives, see Israel as a state that is was created by imperialist oppressors, Europeans and and the powerful Western world at the time, and one that is continuing to oppress Palestinian Arabs. That's a perception that some of the people on the left have. And so since Israel is considered to be a Jewish state by many people's measurements, then Jews must also be blamed for the oppression of the Palestinians, and thus anti-Semitism naturally follows that. So those are kind of two things that I see really as some of the key issues.
Yes, if I could just follow up on that. I think that Scott did a really good job of laying out the background there. I first want to say that I believe that there is bigotry of other types and racism of other types on both ends of the political spectrum. The one thing that I would add to Scott's very good overview is that the current situation in Israel complicates everything. And Israel has, for over a decade now, had a very right-wing government, a government that is full of corruption and has done a lot to undercut the peace process. And I personally am not a fan of the current Israeli government, although I am, and I consider myself pro-Israel, but I am not pro-current Israeli policies in the same way that I, as a proud American, am not always in favor of our government's policies. And I think that for American Jews like me, it has been very painful to see the Israeli government be more interested in the views of right-wing evangelical Christians than in our views. And that is a thing that has happened really over the last decade. And it is, again, it makes me very sad, but it puts, just to put a little contemporary twist in what Scott was saying, I think a lot of what is going on in the left-wing anti-Semitism comes together with a left-wing animosity towards the Netanyahu government. And again, as I say, I think that is very sad. And anyone who is following Israeli politics and knows about the multiple times it took for them just to be able to form a government, they are also a society that is torn apart by some serious divisions.
That was eye-opening to me. I would read about anti-Semitism, and I would see interviews with people in the UK. Sometimes I would see people who would say something like, I've never voted Tory in my life, but I'm not going to vote for the Labour Party because of the anti-Semitic statements that were made. And I would think, I have no idea where that came out of until what you just explained that to me. That really was eye-opening. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. This is very educational. I really appreciate both of your perspectives, Scott and Melinda, because you're bringing in that historical background and a personal connection. So this is such a healthy balance for us to understand the root of this. Holland, I'm just kind of like sitting here just drinking from the fountain and appreciating this information. All right, but we're going to close up our first episode, our part one, with a question that we like to ask our guests. And Melinda, I'm going to start with you first. What is an essential element we need to grasp as we consider the impact of anti-Semitism?
It's a terrific question. One of the things that I think people misunderstand about anti-Semitism and other forms of racism and bigotry is that they look for its causes and they look for its sources in the targets of that bigotry. That is, they look for the causes and sources of anti-Semitism in Jewish people. So, for example, I have often had people say to me, well, why do people think Jews control the media? And honestly, I don't know, because I don't control the media. And I think that others, that is, other people may know. I can tell you the source of many other anti-Semitic stereotypes and tropes. But I think that the most important thing to remember about anti-Semitism is that we have to understand it as a problem not of Jewish people, but as a problem of non-Jewish people interacting with Jewish people. So that when we're thinking about anti-Semitism and its causes, and for that matter, the possible solutions to it, we need to think about the non-Jewish communities' understanding of Judaism rather than looking to Jews. And one of the things I so much appreciated about what Scott said when he introduced himself, the fact that he is not Jewish, but he is a man who recognizes that learning about the Holocaust and fighting anti-Semitism is not just a job for Jews. And that's the only way that we are going to get anywhere in this world.
Thank you. That was beautiful. How about you, Scott?
I completely agree with Linda. I really like how she phrased it, and I like this idea that this is our problem, not a problem for Jews. This is a problem for humanity, and therefore we need to approach it as it needs the collective in order to find a remedy, so to speak. And while we see this, I really see two answers to the question you asked as far as essential elements as we consider the impact of anti-Semitism. While we see that these anti-Semitic incidents recently are certainly alarming, and we have seen this obviously happen over the course of history, human history, this anti-Semitism for a long period of time, I feel that sometimes when we talk about not just the Holocaust, but any form of discrimination, we start to feel like, well, it's part of the human condition, so therefore it's always going to happen. It's an inevitability. And I think that breeds complacency. And so that's what I fear a lot when I hear this idea, like, I can't stop people from being, bigots. It's like, well, you can prevent them from becoming bigots in the first place. I think that's really the key aspect. So I think we shouldn't accept the notion that it's impossible to keep people from discriminating against each other. And secondly, I think, and as part of that, obviously, education is a key component there. But I think secondly, we must also recognize that there's a lot of good being done to fight it. Sometimes we focus so much on the negative. And, oh, my God, you see these incidents, you hear, think about how people came together, and we should start celebrating that. Because after the Tree of Life Synagogue, after the marches in Charlottesville, after those events, we see people come out and be willing to speak out against it. And so that should hopefully give us a lot of hope that there are people out there who really feel the same way and that really are trying to stop this from happening. And so there's potential out there for us to continue to make this better. I think about other movements throughout the course of history, and even just recent history in America. Think of gay rights, for example. I mean, I was thinking maybe sometime in my lifetime, I would see gay marriage approved. And it happened. It happens within the past decade and a half. And so I think it was really surprising for a lot of people that it happened in the way it did. And a lot of people, I felt that it would happen eventually, but I think with other things too, I think we can see similar sorts of progress happen. And there'll be often 2 steps forward, 1 step back at times, but I think we're still trending in the right direction. So let's not become overly negative, I guess. Sorry to be long-winded, but yeah.
Not long-winded at all. I appreciate the positive message. How about you, Holland?
Definitely. And we're going to have to draw a line on this one right now. We want to say a special thanks to Scott Auspelmyer and Melinda Menzer. and ask everyone who's at the table right now to join us next week as we continue to talk with them about the influx of anti-Semitism, the growth of anti-Semitism in the U.S. and in other parts of the world in 2020. While you're waiting on the rest of the conversation, please go to theafterwordpodcast.com and become a subscriber. Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends about us. Remember that you are always welcome at our table.